Good evening, everyone. I'm Max Shapiro, and I'm pleased to welcome everyone to the Roosevelt House for tonight's program featuring Lynn Olson and Professor Benjamin Hatt. Before turning to Lynn, I would first like to acknowledge President Rob, who was here earlier, as well as Harold Holzer, for all of his work here as director of the Public Policy Institute. Although Harold cannot be with us tonight, he assured me he is live streaming right now. As many of you know, Harold is the author and editor of over 50 books on Lincoln and the Civil War. Through his extensive study of history, Harold shares with us not only his passion for Lincoln, but Lincoln himself. His books, lectures, and TV appearances allow all of us, as individuals and as a nation, to better understand Lincoln the President and Lincoln the man. And for that, we're all indebted to you, Harold. When Harold told me Lynn Olson would be returning to Roosevelt House, I immediately thought of Gil Wynant landing in London at the start of the Blitz, when the new American ambassador assured the apprehensive crowd, "There's no place I'd rather be at this time." Lynn, you are a favorite of many of us here. Your ability to place the reader in the middle of the action and allow us to get to know our heroes of history is unmatched. In Troublesome Young Men, we joined the cadre of young Tory rebels who fought against the establishment and their own party, even their own prime minister, to bring Churchill to power. In Citizens of London, we adventured alongside Murrow, Hopkins, Harriman, and Wynant during London's darkest and most suspenseful days. And now, in Last Hope Island, we joined Europe's exiled royalty to win back their homelands from Hitler's iron grip. These stories teach us that even against the greatest of threats, facing the greatest of evils, committed individuals who band together in a common cause can achieve beyond all they hoped, even save the world. Thank you.
All right, well, first of all, welcome everybody, and it's my very great pleasure to have this opportunity to talk to Lynn about this absolutely fascinating book. Lynn, let me start in with a question that I'm always curious about with writers, so let me start by asking you, what drew you to this subject in particular?
Well, it was a long road on this subject. As some of you may know, I've written a number of books about Britain and World War II. And this one actually began, I thought about doing it about more than 10 years ago, after I wrote Troublesome Young Men that Max referred to, because I had done a book with my husband called Question of Honor, which is about the Polish pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain during World War II. And we decided to do it because we saw an old movie, British movie, called The Battle of Britain that had a scene with the Polish pilots, squadron of Polish pilots flying, and, call me stupid, but I didn't know that anybody but British pilots at that point had flown in the Battle of Britain. So, as I said, we wrote a book called Question of Honor, and as we were doing this, I found out that it wasn't just the Poles that were involved in the Allied victory. As I say in this book, most historians portray the victory in World War II as, in terms of the Allies, as British, Soviet, and American. And these occupied European countries are basically seen as victims, and that these three, the big three, came to save them, which they did to some extent. But what nobody has pointed out really is that those occupied countries were allies as well. Their leaders and many of their military fled their countries when Nazi Germany invaded. And they went to London, thanks to Winston Churchill. And they set up their governments in exile, and they actually contributed a tremendous amount, and I assume we'll talk about that more in detail. So to get back to your question, I started doing this research in 10 years ago, and then realized, it was such a huge project, I didn't really know enough, and I thought, this is going to take me decades to do, and well, I won't tell you because it has to do with publishing, and it does not have to do, my editor and my and some wonderful people from Random House are here, and it wasn't Random House, let me tell you. So anyway, I decided to put it aside and wrote Citizens of London instead for Random House, wrote Those Angry Days for Random House, and this book is also for Random House. I finally thought that I knew enough now that I could write this book, and I had already done an enormous amount of research in it, and so I went back to it. And then when I started research again, I thought, boy, this is just a spectacular subject because it is filled with larger-than-life characters. I love to write about people. All my books, I write through people. And this one is, if not the richest, it certainly ranks high up there, just in terms of colorful people who accomplished great things and who are totally forgotten now. So it's a very long-winded answer to your question.
Not at all. Actually, I want to pick up on one of the things you mentioned. There's lots in there that I hope we have a chance to talk about. But let me just pick up the point about kind of overarching interpretations of World War II, because certainly I would count myself among the historians who, until I read your book, I would have unhesitatingly said to my students, the European resistance movements didn't count for very much in the overall balance. The war was won, you put it more or less this way in your book, the war was won by the manufacturing capacity of the three major allies against Germany. Now I'm feeling very bad about that, because I think you make a very good case for the effect in various ways of people from the occupied continental European countries on the war effort. So I think it would be great if we could go into a few of the specifics. Can you talk about some of the ways in which people from Poland, the Netherlands, France, and so on contributed to Allied victory?
Absolutely. First of all, I should say there were 7 Allied countries whose governments in exile were in London. 6 with Charles de Gaulle, it wasn't really government, but so let me go through them. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and the Free French and Charles de Gaulle. I say that because obviously the French had a legal government in Vichy that was collaborating with the Germans at the time. And so I'll give you a couple of short examples, and then if we want to go into more detail. The Poles were incredibly important. I mentioned the Polish Air Force. There were more than 100 Polish pilots who flew in the Battle of Britain, and many people in the RAF credited them that if it hadn't been for them, the battle might well have been lost. They were extraordinarily important, incredibly skilled, the best. Everybody agreed they were the best fighters of them all. The Poles also, many of you probably have seen The Imitation Game, right? You know, the Benedict Cumberbatch, Alan Turing movie, which was very exciting, but it lacked something, which is the fact that Alan Turing and Bletchley Park did not crack Enigma. It was the Poles who cracked Enigma in the early 1930s. And they provided, they saw the war coming, and they provided the British and the French with copies of the Enigma machine in 1939, just before Poland was invaded, plus instructions on how to use it. Both the British and the French have been trying desperately to crack it, and they were not able to. Thanks to the Poles, and I'm not taking, well, I am taking something away from Alan Turing, but not, I mean, he took it and then raised it to, you know, a much higher level, to the nth degree. But without the Poles, even one of Turing's colleagues said, without the Poles, they may not have been able to do that during the war. So Enigma. In terms of intelligence, human intelligence now, apart from signals intelligence, which Breaking Enigma was, human intelligence, there were the Poles, the French, particularly the Poles and the French, had intelligence agents throughout occupied Europe. The Poles on top, who were reporting, who were spying on German military presence everywhere, and were reporting to London on you know, naval forces, on Air Force, on troop movements, on where the submarines were coming, you know, when submarine movements. Toward the end of the war, they reported on gun emplacements and German defenses on the coast of Normandy, which helped make D-Day possible. I mean, if the Allied forces had not known, you know, where those emplacements were, where those defenses were, it would have been very, very, very hard. It was difficult to begin with, but it would have been almost impossible to actually accomplish the invasion. So that's another one. The Norwegians. Small country, 3 million people, basically, but they helped keep Britain alive in the Battle of the Atlantic. German submarines were, sinking British merchant shipping like crazy in 1940 and 1941. It looked like, in fact, that Britain would be defeated if that kept going. The Norwegians had the 4th largest merchant marine fleet in the world and the most modern, and they basically turned all of their ships, more than 1,400, 1,500 ships, over to the British at the most critical time of the war in 1940, after Norway had been invaded and the government came out and went to London. And it helped get Britain through that terrible, terrible time. I could go on, but those are just some of the examples of the European aid.
The Norwegian merchant fleet was one of the ones that most struck me, because I must confess I had absolutely no idea how large the Norwegian merchant fleet was and how important that had been to the British. Let's take up the matter of some of the extraordinary people you talk about, because that is certainly one of the really fascinating things about this book. There are some really fascinating, complex, vivid people here. I want to ask you about one, because I think I have developed a crush on Audrey Dion. So I think I'd like you to talk about her a little bit.
Yeah, Audrey Dion was an amazing woman. She was a 24-year-old Belgian woman who was a commercial artist when the war broke out and Belgium was invaded in 1940. And she was outraged that Belgium gave up. And she saw her father crying. She had never seen her father cry. And she said to her father, this is not going to last. We're going to defeat them. And what she did was to go out and create the most extensive escape line in Europe. There were many escape lines in occupied Europe. What those were networks set up by people within the various countries to help Allied servicemen caught behind enemy lines to escape from Europe, cross the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, neutral Spain, and then get back to Britain. And most of them were pilots. From 41 till the end of the war, there were, as most of you probably know, there were massive bombing raids, Allied bombing raids from England to Germany. And in the course of thousands and thousands of planes, were involved in this. And there were heavy casualties, thanks to the German anti-aircraft. And these planes would fly over Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, mostly. And as a result, many planes were shot down. And many pilots survived, actually. They parachuted out before the planes hit the ground. So there were lots and lots of Allied pilots and aircrew downed, wounded sometimes, and defenseless, basically. And in each of these countries, in all of these countries, escape lines were set up. Didi de Jong, her real name is Andre, but everybody called her Didi, on her own, started organizing an escape line of mostly young people that she knew in Brussels. Most of them were women. When an airman was discovered, they would rescue that airman. They would take him to a safe house. They would get him to Brussels or Paris or whatever. And then they would have couriers. Again, these are mostly young women. These are women in their teens and early 20s who would take these young airmen, Americans mostly and British, and they would go on public transportation, trains, buses, etc. And they had a kind of a line that snaked its way through Belgium and France, and then to the Pyrenees, and then over the mountains and into Spain. And this 24-year-old, young, beautiful 24-year-old woman set this up, and she ran it by herself. The Brits supported her in it. They gave her money, But she insisted that it was hers and her colleagues, that she refused to accept any direction from the British. And she kept it going. She was finally captured 2.5 years later. But the Comet Line, it was called the Comet Line. The Comet Line existed until the end of the war, and they rescued several thousand, I think 8,000. I can't remember right now the number of Allied servicemen. But just think how difficult that is. I mean, you know, you're not talking about Frenchmen or Belgians, or you're talking about, you know, cowboys from Texas who were 6'4", you know, redheaded Scotsmen, you know, people that clearly did not come from there. And you had to get them, you know, across several countries and into Spain. It was an extraordinary organization, and it's stunning that they were able to do what they were able to do. And just one final postscript about Didi Zhang. She disappeared. She was caught by the Gestapo. She disappeared. Everybody thought she had died. At the end of the war, she was found. She was barely alive, but she was in Ravensbrück, the concentration camp for women. And the reason why she survived is she freely admitted to the Gestapo that she was the organizer of the Comet Line, but they wouldn't believe her because they didn't believe that a young, attractive woman could possibly be the organizer of such an important organization.
And actually, part of why she was saved, and one of the things that also struck me about your book is just how many of these remarkable, heroic, you know, in a way creative, entrepreneurial sort of people were women. And women were very active in these kinds of roles. And another one that you talk about is Mary Lindell. Can you tell us a little bit about her?
Yeah, Mary Lindell was another, I'll be short on this. Mary Lindell was another escape line organizer. She was from Britain, actually. She was a young, very wealthy woman who had a mind of her own, to put it mildly, and was very independent, very strong-willed, wouldn't accept any direction from anybody. She was in the French Red Cross during World War I. She married a French aristocrat. She became a countess. And when World War II broke out, when France was captured, was conquered by the Nazis, she started her own little escape line as a French countess, driving airmen to the line between unoccupied France and occupied France. She was caught. She was put into prison for 9 months. She didn't escape. She was released. She went to London, and she announced that she wanted to go back to France and set up another escape line. The British wanted nothing to do with her, but she insisted, and she finally, she wore everybody down, and so they sent her back. She did establish her own escape line, and it became very, very extensive, and she managed to get a lot of people out. She also was caught, sent to Ravensbrück, survived, not surprisingly. Everybody called her the arrogant English woman. I mean, the Germans called her the arrogant English woman. The British, MI9, which is the British organization in charge of getting airmen out of occupied Europe, called her, you know, arrogant. They couldn't stand her. None of the men that she was involved with could stand this woman. But she was incredibly successful, incredibly effective in what she did.
One of the interesting themes that emerges in your book, too, is the sort of questions of cultural mixing and interaction. You especially talk about this in the context of the earlier parts of the war, when you have a lot of people who, by various routes, are getting from occupied Europe to Britain and reestablishing themselves in Britain. And you have a lot of interesting observations about how some of these people react to the British and how the British react to them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. That was, for me, one of the most interesting things about the book. You know, it's so interesting, and we're seeing this played out today about the Britain and Europe. Britain, by its very nature, by being an island, is so different, and the British are so different in their mentality about others than the Europeans are. I mean, you know, the English Channel is only like 28 miles wide, but it's like an ocean. I mean, you know, it's the reason why the Brits have not been invaded for more than, at the time of World War II, for more than 800 years. And meanwhile, continental Europe has experienced countless wars, over the centuries, certainly France. And so there was a real schism, a real chasm in understanding each other. The British, to this day, have this insular mentality, this very strange way of looking at the continent, at Europe. We are of Europe, but not with Europe. I mean, it's very odd. It's just, and they've been that way for centuries, and so it was a real cultural divide between these two countries. I mean, the Brits, got fed up with all the quarreling and all the rivalries and all the difficulties that the exiled governments went through, not really understanding what it was like to be occupied. That's one point that I make over and over in this book, and I really believe it. I certainly found myself thinking about it a lot. I don't think you can judge anybody who lived in occupied Europe unless you've actually been there yourself. I mean, unless you've lived there. In other words, I'm not talking about people who collaborated, and turned over Jews and things like that. I'm talking about people who had to live with Germans. And the Brits obviously suffered a great deal during World War II. There's no question. They were bombed. The rationing was severe. They were really on the front line, the civilians, but it wasn't the same as living under German control, direct German control. And I don't think the Brits ever really understood that. And especially, for example, when they were sending saboteurs over, where they were training agents from these countries and sending them back into these countries, and not really understanding how extraordinarily ruthless and how extraordinarily skilled the Germans were at finding and capturing these people. And that they kept saying, oh, you don't have to worry about them. They don't know about our radios. They don't, that was not true, as the Dutch and the French and other countries found out. So that there was this great divide between the Brits and the Europeans. It never really went away, although as the war went on, there was much more cooperation, and the Brits started realizing that they had to take these countries, they had to actually talk to these countries and work with these countries in order to win the war. But there still was that, that very, very strong difference in how they viewed the world.
And you talk interestingly about some of the legacy that leaves, which is a point I want to come back to. But just for the moment, one of the stories in your book that really kind of struck me and stayed with me is a little sort of story about an Austrian refugee woman who's with a British family, and the little boy's dog dies. Can you just tell people that one?
If I can remember. Yeah. It's in a chapter when I talk about how welcoming, to some extent, the British were to these Europeans, because at a time when nobody expected them to win, nobody expected the British to win, these people had actually come to Britain. It wasn't a done deal. We look back at Britain as the refuge of the last hope island, and it was, but we didn't know that, in fact, it was going to survive. Back then, nobody knew it was going to survive. In fact, a lot of people, including Franklin Roosevelt and his administration, didn't think it was going to survive. So these Europeans came over at a time when, it wasn't clear that this was going to work out. And so as a result, the British really did open their arms to some extent to the Europeans who came in, because they were citizens of London. I wrote a book called Citizens of London, and what that means is they were there. They were there suffering the same things, the bombings, et cetera, that the British were. And so that there was a camaraderie, between them. And I totally forgot your question. I was leading to it.
The anecdote about the dog who dies, and how the British family reacts.
There was a young Austrian refugee woman who was there with her husband, who was a German refugee. He was a journalist and an author, and she was an author as well. And she and her young daughter were sent to live in Oxford during the time of the Blitz. And she wrote a lot about how she appreciated and was grateful for the British for what they were doing, but how there was this complete, the British didn't understand what it was like, what she was going through or what other refugees were going through. And she told this story about she and her daughter were at dinner one day with this family that she was staying with, and a neighbor came in and told the young boy, the son of the family, that his dog had just been killed by a car. And the little boy burst into tears, and his mother, scolded him, for losing his, for his emotion, and buck up, stiff upper lip, that kind of thing. And it struck this young Austrian refugee. She fled crying from the table, because it just, the difference between her country, where you could show your emotion, when something like that, you cried, you suffered, and the British, who had this kind of stoic attitude, and for her, it was the bottom line of as much as she appreciated what the British were doing, she knew she wasn't British, and she could never be British, and that they didn't really understand, what it was like, what it was that she was going through. They were giving her enormous hospitality, but she had lost her whole life. She had lost her country, and that moment, I'm really glad you brought that moment to her, just kind of summed up all the losses that she had experienced.
I liked it just because I thought it's one of those, in your book is full of them, these nicely observed little moments which do have a really broad significance, I think, in the kind of overarching theme of your book. Okay, now let me just ask you about something else now. Some of what you write about, you mentioned some of the sort of British, somewhere between incomprehension and arrogance sometimes, of what was happening to agents that they sent to the continent. They didn't fully grasp the danger of the situation. And then there's, of course, as always in human things, there's a lot of inter-service feuding between the British intelligence agencies that are doing this. And a lot of what you write about there reminded me of, there's a funny moment in Kim Philby's autobiography, the famous British double agent and traitor who served with MI6, the British intelligence service, during the war. And he said the MI6 officers were really happy when the war was over and they could get back to fighting the real enemy, which was MI5, the other British intelligence service, not the Germans. And I was sort of thinking about that. You write a lot about the organization SOE, Special Operations Executive, and how they got along or didn't get along much with MI6. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, above MI5 in terms of MI6's enemies was SOE. SOE was set up in the summer of 1940 when, Britain was at its nadir. When it really looked like Britain was going to go down. It had nothing to, how could it fight back? Its army had been basically had been defeated. Not defeated, but it certainly could not, do anything on the offensive against Germany. It had started a bombing campaign, but that really hadn't, gone anywhere. It had a blockade, a naval blockade, but that wasn't doing. So there was nothing that they really could do to fight back. And then they came up with this idea. Okay, if we can't do that, then we will start resistance movements within the occupied countries. So we will have the people, rise up and resist the Germans. Which sounded great, but first of all, Hitler, conquered all of most of Europe, and there was no way that could happen. But SOE persisted, and it would take far too long to talk about it, as I do go into great detail. They had no idea what they were doing when they started. I mean, there was no handbook to say how to start a resistance organization. So they were all doing it all on the fly. And most of these people who were in SOE, top people in SOE, were journalists or bankers or lawyers. They hadn't the slightest idea how to go about this. So it was really slapdash in the beginning, and the results were not good. In fact, many, many agents died as a result of their lack of understanding of how this should be organized, and their lack of understanding of the Germans, quite frankly, and as I said before. And it took many people died, especially in Holland and France. And it took a couple of years before they started actually to learn how to be, an organization sending these agents over, and again, to work with the occupied countries themselves. They basically ignored the governments in exile, who knew, for example, what Holland was like. Holland being a very flat, heavily populated country, it's very hard to insert agents in there. I mean, there's no forest, there's no mountains, you can't just, parachute them over Amsterdam. I mean, and they didn't really understand the difficulties in all these countries. They did learn, but it took a long time. And the rivalry between SOE and MI6 didn't help. I mean, SOE and MI6 really fought each other, like Kim Philby said. They fought each other. They sometimes thought the other was worse than the Germans. I mean, at least that was the impression that a lot of people who worked for both of those organizations had, that that they were focusing on the other organization, not on the Germans.
I want to go back now to the sort of, in a sense, legacy questions. The last 3 or so chapters of your book are a very sort of thoughtful consideration of what all this means afterwards when these people come home from Britain or their intelligence service is over and on the shattered continent of Europe in 1945. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, some of the legacies of these experiences that they had during the war.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it was a life-changing moment obviously, for virtually everybody, both those in London and those on the continent. One thing that came through to the people in London, the exiled governments in London, was they had to do something to make sure this never happened again. Most of the countries who had been invaded and occupied, a number of them had been neutral. I mean, there was no cooperation, there was no partnership before the war. They desperately hoped, and I'm talking about countries like Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, desperately hoped that, that Hitler would forget them as they had forgotten them, as Germany had not invaded Norway, for example, in World War I, and had not invaded the Netherlands. So they hoped that they could skip the war again, and that's not the way it turned out to be. And in fact, their neutrality made them, that they had nothing to fight back with. And so a number of these countries, number of the people from these countries, the leaders of these countries, decided that they would start talking to each other about doing something to make sure that didn't happen again. Now, remember, this is the first time that any of these leaders had ever worked together. I mean, it was such a special situation in London. I mean, you had presidents, you had kings, queens, prime ministers, top government officials working together in an environment that could never have happened before. And so they got to know each other. They worked together, but they also socialized together. So you had, and that went all from the top to the bottom. I mean, the military, the young pilots, Belgians, French, Norwegians, Poles, were out partying with RAF pilots, and that went all the way up. And so you had them actually getting to know each other, and as a result of this, they started meeting together to talk about a European Union, about uniting Europe, to make sure that this catastrophe would never happen again. And the seedbed of the current European Union, the seedbed of the unification campaign in Europe, that began in wartime London. Without wartime London, quite frankly, the EU might never have been, it might never be here. And regardless of what you think of the EU now, there is no question that that unification campaign was successful, and because it was successful, guaranteed more than half a century of security and prosperity for Western Europe. There is absolutely no question that's true. I don't particularly want to get into now, but I think people don't realize that. I mean, the World War II has been forgotten in that regard, how important it was. And so that is probably the most significant thing to come out of World War II, and the fact that all those people were together. You know, the really ironic thing is that Winston Churchill was the godfather of the EU. He really is, because without him, without his invitation to all these governments, to all these leaders, to the military, they would never have come to England. They could never have made the contributions that they did to the Allied victory. And you know, the idea of European unification may never have happened, but it was because of him. They wanted him, they wanted England, Britain, to lead them after the war. They wanted Britain to be the leader in the unification campaign. And Churchill and Britain said no. No, it's back to, you know, we're going to be insular again. You know, our idea of our destiny is our empire and a very close relationship with the United States. That's what Churchill wanted. Well, the empire was fast fading away even then, and that close relationship, while it was a special relationship, it was never as close as Churchill and the British wanted it. So, you know, we could have had, you know, the Europeans were absolutely willing to hand over the baton to Britain, and the Brits just said no, thank you, and we're living with the consequences.
Without wanting to push you too much into now, I just want to pick up on one last aspect of that, which is that some of this differential British attitude to unification is rooted in the wartime experience and the different British wartime experience. And you talk a little bit about that. Can you just say a few things about that?
Yeah, the Brits think of World War II as very, very differently than the Europeans do. I mean, it was their finest hour, and they are so proud of what, quite rightly, of what they did in World War II. I mean, of standing up against Hitler, of being the last hope island, when nobody else, you know, the U.S. was still out of it, was still neutral. The Soviets weren't involved, and surviving, and not only surviving, but keeping basically the world together until the U.S. and the Soviet Union got into it. And so for them, it is their finest hour, and for the, you know, for the Europeans, it was a catastrophe. Nobody thinks it was their finest hour. They contributed a lot to the victory, but their countries were devastated. Millions of people were killed, and the difference that's a huge difference, and to this day it governs the way the British think and the way the Europeans think.
It's a fascinating book, highly readable, and this is a book from which I think anyone interested in World War II will learn things. I certainly learned a lot from it. So thank you for writing it. We're going to throw it open for questions now. Sir, the gentleman. Yes, sir. You.
Ask you a question about your research on the book and the degree, if any, maybe there wasn't any, are there any people still alive that you were able to talk to who were participating in these efforts in London?
In my most recent bit of research, not really. In earlier research, for example, for the Poles, I did, and my husband and I did a lot of interviews with Polish pilots who had actually flown in the Battle of Britain and had flown for, you know, the RAF during the war. Many of them stayed in Britain. As you know, Poland was handed over to Stalin at the end of the war, and I talk a lot about that in the book. And so they really had no place to go. I mean, they had families back in Poland, but it was communist. It had turned communist, and they really felt that they had to stay in England. And so many of them never saw their families again. So we did talk to them. Much of my research was actually it was firsthand research, but a lot of it was in archives. It was reading people's papers and diaries, of the time, and letters, which, I think are just invaluable, particularly if you do research about Britain, as I've done a lot, especially in World War II. The Brits are spectacular in keeping diaries and letters, and you learn so much, from Churchill on down, to ordinary people. They're wonderful at doing that, and then they're wonderful at maintaining them in archives. So that's where I really got a lot of. But what was really fun to me in terms of research was finding out about people that I didn't know about. For example, the King of Norway. I write a lot about him and how he escaped from, I had no idea of any of this and how important he was. And I have to put a plug in for my favorite character in the whole book, who is Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, who is a force of nature, to put it mildly. I mean, she grew up as a very lonely little girl, and she was very strong-willed, and nobody would listen to her. She became queen when she was 10, and she was 59 when the war happened. And as a result of the war, she finally made people listen to her. And it's a delightful kind of life's journey that she finally, she had always wanted to do great deeds like her famed predecessors had, and she was never able to do it until World War II. And I talk a lot in the book about her. And I read her autobiography. I read her papers. So that's where I got much of my stuff.
The lady right at the back.
Thank you. When you said that the military from the occupied country fled to London, I think you forgot to talk about all the French soldiers who went to war and they were caught by the German army and sent to prisoner camp with terrible condition. And some of them died, and actually a few of them died of malnutrition and everything. And a lot of people forget about that. I'm telling you, my father was one of them, as long as my uncles and friends of the family. So I don't like the fact when we say military fled from the occupied country, like the refugee in London. Not all of them. Most of them, they went to fight their own country. They didn't stay at home, or they didn't say they went to fight. But
when I said
they
flee,
didn't win.
I don't mean that they were fleeing fighting. No. First of all, I agree with you. There were millions of French soldiers who were captured and treated terribly in prisoner of war camps, which is true of all the occupied countries. I mean, Poles and Czechs and all of them. There were many. I'm talking about people that once their countries fell, when I say flee, I meant escaped to fight on. All these people, That's right, but you're absolutely right. But there were many military who did go to London, including French, and went to North Africa, including French, and followed de Gaulle, and eventually became a very large army that came back into France and helped liberate France as well as the rest of Europe. So you're right; they were all over, but there were large military contingents in Britain.
There's also sort of a myth that France didn't fight very hard in 1940. Actually, in this roughly 6 weeks of the 1940 campaign, the French had about 120,000 killed in action, which doesn't happen if you're not fighting, basically. So it's not a widely known. Yes.
Talk a little bit about the governments in exile and what the transition was like for them to move back. I mean, we're familiar perhaps more than others with de Gaulle going in, and that's sort of dramatic. But what about some of these other countries, and what challenges do they face of basically a devastated country going back to reclaim their governments?
Actually, many of them, when they went back, resumed power. Took over. They were foreign minister in London, and they became foreign minister. Initially, the initial transition, basically it was status quo before the war. A lot of especially the resistance wanted a new world, that they had fought and they had suffered, and they wanted a new life, a new, focused on justice, economic justice, and, shaking up the old state societies. That didn't happen for quite a long time in most of these countries. The people who had actually lived there basically wanted their life back, and they wanted to eat, and they wanted to, go to school, and they wanted to work, and they wanted life to be like it was before the war. And to some extent that happened, to the frustration of many people, again, in the resistance. That did start to change, though. You can't go through a catastrophe like World War II and not have life fundamentally changed. And that's when the kind of the welfare state that basically exists in much of Europe, that's when it began, the late 40s, early 50s, when some of these young resistors started going into the government and actually shaking things up. So domestically, it changed, and also internationally. That's when a lot of these people who had been, again, in some of these, in the exiled governments, became the leaders of the European Union movement. People like Jean-Paul Spaak, who was the Belgian foreign minister in the government in exile, and he is one of the the godfathers, one of the forefathers of the European movement.
Sir.
There's a factor that maybe ought to be discussed a little bit, and that is the Soviet Union, because Germany attacked Poland first and then the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union, in a book I read recently, lost something like 27 million people in World War II, and they were determined to Stalin and Roosevelt and Churchill agreed at Tehran that there would be an unconditional surrender, which meant that the Germans would surrender to both the Soviets and the Western powers at the same time, which is, of course, when the time came, something the Germans preferred not to do. So the bottom line was that when you talk about, Poland being given back, I think those were the words you used, I'm not sure that would be quite the way I would describe it, to the Soviet Union. And these Poles now were kind of stuck because they had to go back to a Russian-controlled country. So what did happen to the ones that were in England, and to the Czechs as well, and to those people for whom the eastern part of Europe, perhaps rightly, became part of the spoils of war?
Well, I would disagree with you about rightly.
Well, I wouldn't say rightly, but I would say not a spoil
Well,
of war.
I mean, what you're saying is right. I mean, the Soviet Union did take, obviously, the brunt of the fighting, and in order to make sure that it did keep taking the brunt of the fighting, Churchill and Roosevelt basically gave Stalin what he wanted, which was basically, he wanted Poland, and then he wanted a bunch of Eastern Europe. What happened to them is what I was talking about before. Most of the Poles did not go back. Those who did go back, including one of the young Polish cryptographers who broke Enigma, were, basically, some of them were actually killed, but many of them were imprisoned, and they were always under scrutiny, Soviet scrutiny, because anybody who had fought for the West, who fought in the West, was regarded as a criminal by the Soviets. And that's true of the Czechs as well. So Poland, unfortunately, has, is in a terrible geographical position, right between Germany and Russia, and it's been terrible for centuries for them, and it really was terrible. What is so disheartening is that the Poles, particularly the Poles, did so much to help win the war. And I haven't even talked about the Polish armies. That they had tremendous. They had 200,000 Poles were in British uniform at the end of the war, and most of them had fought either in the Air Force, in the Navy, or most of them were in the Army. And this is how they were, this is what happened to them. And it is, yeah, it's realpolitik, but it's a real tragedy as well.
All right, we have time for a couple more. Yes?
The Americans, like when I grew up, you looked at Europe, at England as this unified Churchillian motion, and everyone was on board. I was wondering if your research turned up areas of Great Britain where there was resistance or they didn't throw in with support of the Churchill government, and if so, how did Churchill deal with that?
Well, I think basically the Brits were unified, but that there certainly was no question that was true in 1940, 1941. As the war went on, I think I wouldn't say there was resistance, but people were getting very war weary, not to put it mildly, and they wanted something in return. In other words, they like the rest of Europe wanted a different life. They had suffered, they wanted to see something, they wanted social justice, they wanted, good jobs, they wanted a different Europe, a different England than the class conscious, England that existed. And so as the war went on, there was greater and greater and greater pressure on the government to do that. And quite frankly, that was one reason I think Winston Churchill lost in 1945. I remember as a kid, and even until I started writing these books, why did they turn out, Winston Churchill? He won the war for them. Well, I understood doing research why they did, because they were tired. They wanted a better life, basically. And he was a wonderful war prime minister. He wouldn't have been a wonderful peace prime minister.
He wasn't when he got the chance. A wonderful peace prime minister.
Right, exactly. Later on.
All right, one more question.
No more
Yes,
down
wait at the back.
What was the capacity of Germany to produce military equipment towards the end of the war?
I think my questioner would be better answering that. Actually, I really don't know. You want to answer that?
Sure, actually, I got my own. Good. The common thing you read is that the peak year for German military production was 1944, which also coincides with the height of the bombing, which casts a little doubt on how effective the strategic bombing campaign was. The sort of standard historian's answer until a few years ago was that in 1942, Hitler appointed Albert Speer, his architect, to be Minister of War Production, and Speer succeeded in greatly ramping up German industry, which had not been at full speed before. That's what historians thought for many years, because basically that's what Speer said after the war, because he wanted to make himself look good. More recent research has uncovered the fact that the German economy was actually going at full stretch all the way through. But at the end of the day, the Germans got into a war with three countries that just swamped them, with the aid of European resistance, as I will now be careful to add in my classes. But the industrial capacity of the USSR and Britain and the USA just absolutely swamped the Germans towards the end. All right, well, I think that pretty much...
Well, thank you. I'm Bill Goldstein, the head of programming here, and I want to thank Ben Hett and Lynn Olson, and thank you, Max Shapiro, as well. And I invite you all up to the Four Freedoms room. We'll have a reception and a book signing so that you can ask more questions of Lynn Olson and Ben Hett, I suppose. So thank you all very much.